I appreciate this opportunity. Thanks to the supporters of this conference. I want to introduce myself a bit more. As you can tell by the accent, I'm originally from the U.S., and actually I come from the great Ron Paul state and the attempting to secede state of Texas. So it was quite the travel and journey to get here. I learned about Mises.org in late 2006, and I wish Walter Block was here because I'm going to tell some stories, and he's a part of a few of them. I was reading Ayn Rand, and she recommended Mises for economics, so I did a Google search and found Mises.org. I'm not a Randian, by the way. And so I read all I could on Mises.org. I downloaded all the audio lectures I could. I particularly liked Walter Block's Radical Austrianism, Radical Libertarianism. And that's all I had on my MP3 player were Mises.org lectures. I listened to those, a few of them over and over, and eventually I was invited to teach economics at the University of Northampton, and my background's business and not economics, no formal training in economics. But I was able to walk in and teach economics just sort of off the cuff, and that's not because of my ability, that's because of everything I learned by listening to these audio lectures, which was great, and they're still there, and there's many more now, both from Walter Block and Murray Rothbard. So my topic was entrepreneurship for my thesis, and Austrian economics was a very good fit for that, as they were pretty much the only school of economics that had a robust theory of the entrepreneur. So a year later, in 2007, I sent an article to Joe Salerno to try and attend the Austrian Scholars Conference. And after I presented, Walter Block asked me a question about advertising, and it was a very nice question. I was able to answer it. And I've attended every other year since. And in 2011, I attended, and I was talking to Jeff Tucker, and he said that most of the major advancements in the future he believes will come from this side of the world, and we're specifically talking about Australia, so I have high hopes. I attended a Rothbard graduate seminar in 2008 where Walter Block was, and I was teaching entrepreneurial marketing at Swinburne University at the time, and I wanted to relate Walter Block's concept of slander and reputation and how you don't own your reputation, it's what everybody else thinks of you, to the idea of brand equity, that companies don't own their brands, it's what people perceive about them, both good and bad. So I walked up to Walter after mustering a bit of confidence, who was talking to Bob Murphy. I said, Walter, I think you could use this analogy, maybe people get that companies don't own their brands, you can relate that to we don't own our reputation. And he sort of looked at me very serious and said, yes, so. And I think he thought I was disagreeing with him until Bob Murphy pointed out that I was agreeing with him, and I never do want to disagree with Walter Block. So I'm going to go over Making Economic Sense by Murray Rothbard, but I'm going to give some examples from my experience and my time living in Melbourne. But it seems difficult to criticize a country of which you are not a citizen. I'm glad that Chris Leitner was able to criticize the U.S., and of course I don't take any offense at that. We can criticize them all day long. But it is akin to when you criticize your family but get offended or defensive when others do it, even though the criticisms may be the same. So I'm somewhat reluctant to criticize policies in Australia, especially because I feel like I'm in a dilemma. If I criticize the U.S., well then I'm from the U.S. and talking about the U.S. as if the U.S. were the only country in the world. But if I criticize Australia, it's as if I'm from the U.S. and I can criticize Australia. So just so you know, I love Australia. My family almost remained here. My son was born here. He's an Australian citizen. And I had to it was very difficult, but it's only recently that he became a U.S. citizen, after paying the government money, of course. So I love Australia, and I could criticize the U.S. all day, but bad economic policies, it doesn't matter where they come from, so we don't discriminate, so we can criticize them. So I want to point out the relevance of Rothbard by reading something that could have been written by Peter Schiff, Ron Paul, Lou Rockwell, or whomever, but it was written back in the 80s by Murray Rothbard. It's a pretty long quote, so bear with me. He says, the economic acumen of establishment politicians, economists, and the financial press, never very high at best, has plunged to new lows in recent years. the state of confusion, self-contradiction, and general feather-brainedness has never been so rampant. Almost any event can now be ascribed to any cause, or to the contradiction of the very cause assigned the previous week. If the Fed raises short-term interest rates, the same analyst can say at one point that this is sure to raise long-term rates very soon, while starting at another point that it is bound to lower long-term rates, each contradictory pronouncement being made with the same air of certitude and absolute authority. It is a wonder that the public doesn't dismiss the entire guild of economists and financial experts, let alone the politicians, as a bunch of fools and charlatans. In the past year and a half, the usual geyser of pseudo-economic humbug has accelerated into virtual gibberish by the current administration to put a happy face on every possible morsel of economic news. Is unemployment up? But that's good, you see, because it means that inflation will be less of a menace, which means that interest rates will fall, which means that unemployment will soon be falling. And besides, we don't call layoffs unemployment anymore, we call it downsizing, and that means the economy will get more productive, soon decreasing unemployment. What? You say that interest rates have gone up despite the administration's budget staking much of its forecasts on the assurance that interest rates will go down? But that's okay, because you see higher interest rates will check inflation, bringing interest rates down, so we were right all along. And so down means up means down, and round she goes, and where she stops, nobody knows. So you may have seen this video, and I used to show this video to my students, and it's wonderful, but it's basically everything I just read to you. I'll show you the video. It's similar to The Onion. The only difference is we know that this is satire.
Well, back home, and since mid-2007, borrowing costs have gone up 100 basis points for business and 90 for households, and there's likely to be another interest rate rise in May, despite what they say. RBA Board Secretary Tony Froth joins me from Sydney. Tony Froth, what is the Reserve Bank and why is it putting interest rates up?
Well, Sean, the Reserve Bank is a very special kind of bank which looks after monetary policy in this country. We put up the interest rate to discourage people from spending. Less spending, less demand. Less demand, prices fall. Prices fall, inflation reduces.
Yes, but a higher interest rate means things you have to borrow money for, like houses, end up actually being more expensive.
Well, yes, you spend more on houses and less on day-to-day things like food. Less food purchases, oversupply. Oversupply, cheaper prices. Cheaper prices, less inflation.
Yeah, but won't people buy more things if they're cheaper?
Well, not if you have less money.
Yes, but doesn't that put me in the same position? Either I have more money to buy expensive things or less money to buy the same things when they're cheaper.
Well, exactly. It's about putting things on an even keel.
Yes, but getting there is what's difficult, isn't it?
Well, it's pretty straightforward.
Yes, but if I suddenly have to spend 40% of my income on my mortgage instead of 20%...
Well, less money to spend, less demand. Less demand, prices drop.
But that assumes I have a choice. If I've only got 60% of my income to spend, but have the same amount to buy as when I had 80% to feed my family or clothe them or educate them, then...
Well, you can't. You have less money to spend. Less spending, supply outstrips demand. Supply per unit drops in price. Things have to become affordable or they won't sell. That's the beauty of a free market.
Ah, but it's not a free market, is it? You're interfering with it.
Well, you have to, otherwise you end up with a depression. Awful business. People leaping out of windows, that sort of thing.
People drop, fewer people, less demand, prices drop.
Very true.
Thank you, Tony. Sorry, is Tony Froth still on hold? Can we bring him up? Tony Froth, hi. Something occurred to me during the break. If interest rates rise, they don't just rise for consumers, do they? They also rise for business. I think the business lending rate's now about 17%.
Well, it's 17.2, actually.
OK. Well, doesn't that mean they've got less money to spend, will produce less, which lowers supply? Lower supply, same demand, prices rise.
Lower production, less work. Less work, higher unemployment. Higher unemployment, less spending, lower prices.
You certainly thought this through. Thanks, Tony.
Pleasure.
Look, is Tony Froth still there? Because I just want to ask him a question. Tony, sorry to bother you again, but I was wondering, is it possible to open an account at the Reserve Bank and borrow money? It's just that your interest rate is still a lot lower than the regular banks.
No, we don't do that sort of thing. We just do the paperwork on the issuing of banknotes, so we get to say what they're worth. That's pretty much it.
Right, right. How do you work that out? It's all, I suppose, relative to the gold reserves, isn't it?
No, we've sold the bulk of our gold reserves. Look, it's all based on the value of our reserves of foreign currency.
Okay.
No one uses gold these days, Sean. My God, where have you been?
Although if no one uses gold and everyone's using everyone else's currency to value their money, then surely it's ultimately not worth anything. Tony Froth, many thanks.
I hope you enjoyed that. I know it was a few minutes, but it's nothing different than you'd hear on the news, except it's meant to be funny. So, I want to go over a few things here. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to share some of my experiences while I was in Melbourne and talk about Rothbard's Making Economic Sense. I had an incident just a few months after arriving to Australia. I took the train to work every day, a journey of about 30 minutes, which gave me good time to study and prepare for my classes. On this particular day, I was on the train around 11 a.m. when many of the then Connex wannabe cop thugs authorities would come to the train to make sure passengers had actually purchased a ticket. They usually come in a group of 2 to 3 workers and appear as if they came from the Matrix, often wearing long dark coats. I don't know if you've seen them, at least in Melbourne. On this occasion, I had a big binder of journal articles that I was reading and reviewing for my thesis. I opened my binder after the first Connex worker who checked my ticket had passed to begin reading again, not realizing there was another worker who was going to pass me by. The next Connex authority came by so suddenly that as I closed my reading materials to make way for him to pass, my foot brushed across the seat in front of me. The worker immediately said, in a very stern tone, of course, "Get your foot off the seat and wipe it off." Of course, there was nothing on the seat, and my foot actually only touched the white part, not the fabric part of the seat, just to be technically correct. He asked for identification, and for whatever reason, my passport proved insufficient. He asked if I had a utility bill or something showing a local address. Since I don't typically carry around utility bills, my options, as I found out, were limited to A, having the police escort me from the station to the university so that one of my fellow employees could verify my employment being about 3 months at this time, or B, getting a hold of my wife to confirm our address. I gave the worker my wife's cell phone number, who, as it turned out, was putting our children down for a nap, a coveted time of day for her. She did not answer her phone the first time. I entertained the idea, albeit briefly, of going to my work and seeing just how ridiculous this whole fiasco could become. With hindsight, I should have stood up, taken out my cell phone, and recorded the incident, because the worker was obviously standing above me and on a power trip. Anyway, the worker decided to call my wife again. This time she answered. Here's what the worker said, in a Middle Eastern accent, by the way. "We have your husband here and we need you to give us your address." My wife thought I'd been kidnapped and they were coming for her and the kids. Although I'm pretty laid back at this point, I was livid. I received a ticket for my foot touching the seat. I went to my office and contacted The Age, who was excited to do a story on this since I was a foreigner and an academic. I gave them my story and someone came to take my picture, which came out in a half-page article in the paper on page 3. The picture, by the way, was totally natural. We just walked on the train. There was that girl with her feet up on the seat. I didn't have to ask her anything. And they took the picture. It even says arriving Glen Ferry Station in the background, which is where I worked. The ticket was $168, and I was not about to pay it. I also found out that the government issued 18,347 foot-on-the-seat fines the year before. The fines, although handed out by Connex ticket inspectors, are ultimately issued by the Department of Transport and bring in $3.1 million a year. They call this revenue, as if there ever was a euphemism for taxes. On average, 50 train passengers a day were fined for having their feet on seats. It was leaked just a day before the incident in a business plan from Connex to the Department of Transport that Connex would bring in more revenue from tickets, meaning tickets, fines. As it turned out, I fought the ticket and it was eventually waived 1 year later. So this is also the time when I began to investigate the nature of public-private partnerships, such as the one that Connex had with the government. Public-private partnerships, or PPPs, are essentially contracts between a public agency and a private company where assets, risks, and rewards are shared in providing a good or service to the public. The rationale is typically that private enterprise provides greater efficiency and quality of service, while the government agency furnishes additional capital. They are claimed to potentially lead to happy employees, better educational opportunities, and better public safety. PPPs date back to at least 1652 and are nothing new. In Australia, 10% of the infrastructure is a public-private partnership. They are used for water, wastewater, transportation, urban development, and the delivery of social services. One of the reasons given for PPPs is to spur innovation. There are many reasons why this proves difficult, if not impossible. Private businesses that have a government-granted monopoly from a PPP will have less or no competition, decreasing any incentive to increase efficiency and provide better quality services and products at lower prices. Innovation is also less likely if the partnership specifies revenue will be obtained in a cost-plus percentage arrangement, where companies will be guaranteed a specified amount of gross profit regardless of revenue or cost. When the PPP contract guarantees a period of time, typically years, companies may no longer be interested in increasing profits, as there is little danger of going out of business during that time frame. Thus, they have no stringent requirement of meeting the market profit and loss test, since they cannot lose. Mises pointed out the flaw in trying to use PPPs as a catalyst to innovation. To say to the entrepreneur of an enterprise with limited profit chances, behave as the conscientious bureaucrats do, is tantamount to telling him to shun any reform. Nobody can be at the same time a correct bureaucrat and an innovator. Progress is precisely that which the rules and regulations did not foresee. It is necessarily outside the field of bureaucratic activities. End quote. In addition, progress and innovation may also be trapped by old government regulations, codes, and established ideas. If it ain't broke, don't fix it is the motto of the government bureaucrat. And as Mises points out, these are typically old men with established ideas of what works and what doesn't. In contrast, innovation is more than just making sure a product ain't broke. It is about improving an already functional and highly demanded product, or creating, as Joseph Schumpeter said, new combinations of products or services, methods of production, etc. Companies and private-public partnerships that wish to introduce innovations require going through government red tape and levels of bureaucracy for approval. If it were not for a government guarantee of monopoly privilege, such a time gap for bureaucrat approval would likely eliminate any first-mover advantage in the market. Furthermore, investment capital will not necessarily be generated from savings or business operations, but possibly from a shared government budget. Finally, instead of an incentive to earn as much profit as possible, governments often set a limit on the amount of total profit, and tax or remove any profit above the arbitrarily specified amount, thereby discouraging companies from innovating. Companies in a partnership with government will also lose ultimate control of their decision-making abilities. For instance, government would be less likely to allow a company to take risks, which could affect any government revenue, quote unquote, originating from the company. Maintaining the status quo is the name of the game. Companies must, in the end, follow the government's wishes and whims, not their own, nor their consumers. The company sees risk not in terms of whether the consumer will buy its product or service, but in terms of whether it is in line with the designs of the bureaucrat. Any risk then becomes focused on pleasing the bureaucrat at the expense of pleasing the consumer. Thus, government is their ultimate customer. On the other hand, risk of failure is essentially reduced to nil for the length of the contract due to government's ability to subsidize losses through taxation or other coercive measures. Obtaining government contracts for smaller companies becomes virtually impossible, and it eliminates any future startup companies and investment in that market. Thus, competition and the threat of competition are close to none. We now see that government is truly the enemy, not the oft viewed and mistakenly confused supporter of the startup entrepreneur, i.e. the little guy. When government is able to partner with a private company and grant access to land, labor, and/or capital that would not have occurred absent government intervention, everyone's property is exposed to risk, the risk of government takeover. A private company may not be able to construct a highway through the private property of others. Government, through powers of eminent domain, is able to seize private property from individuals and construct nearly anything it desires. In other words, government is able to not only extract money from private individuals through taxes, but also to take away their more tangible private property. One of the dangers of public-private partnerships is that it contains the word private, so it's often viewed as more legitimate and with less hostility than solely the term public. Thus, they may expand and multiply without real justification and with little hostility. The already flawed and misunderstood meaning of public goods then expands beyond the initial neoclassical interpretation to mean anything which could be deemed of good for the public. Murray Rothbard explains how government's violent intervention in one part of the economy results in what he calls calculational chaos, which inevitably spreads to other parts. He says, each governmental firm introduces its own island of chaos into the economy. There's no need to wait for full socialism for chaos to begin its work. No government enterprise can ever determine prices or costs or allocate factors or funds in a rational, welfare-maximizing manner. He says that government cannot be run on a business basis. He later points out that any governmental operation injects a point of chaos into the economy, and since all markets are interconnected in the economy, every governmental activity disrupts and distorts pricing, the allocation of factors, consumption investment ratios, etc. Every government enterprise not only lowers the social utilities of the consumers by forcing the allocation of funds to other ends than those desired by the public, it lowers the utility of everyone, including some bureaucrats and government officials, by distorting the market and spreading calculational chaos. The greater the extent of government ownership, of course, the more powerful this impact will become. End quote. I did have another recent experience in the U.S. My wife was on her way home from taking a friend to the airport. She was going 72 miles per hour in a 60-mile-per-hour zone. She was in a hurry partly because my son was carsick and needed to throw up, and she was on the highway. When the cop pulled her over, the cop wanted to know why she was speeding. She mentioned my son's sickness, and the cop told her to take him on the side of the freeway to get some air. Literally, the side of the freeway, and my son just turned 3 years old. The officer showed no sympathy and wrote my wife a ticket for speeding, close to $200, and at the time for our car not being inspected, another fine of $200. However, the officer said the inspection fine could be waived if we got the car inspected within 20 days. So my wife got the car inspected that day and called the local authority to let them know the inspection fine should be removed. They told her it is waived after we paid a $20 dismissal fee. Rothbard writes about this use of creative semantics and other euphemisms for taxes, such as the dismissal fee. He wrote, "Taxes and the tax bite into people's earnings keep going up on the federal, state, county, and local levels of government. Semantic disguises won't work anymore. Call them fees or contributions or insurance premiums. They are taxes nevertheless, and they are increasingly draining people's substance." Turns out this isn't the end of my run-in with the police in the U.S. These are the latest cop cars roaming around Texas, besides the Hummers they have. It turns out a week later I was in a car with two of the dentists who I work with. One was driving and got pulled over. He was speeding in a school zone, was not wearing a seatbelt. His car was not inspected or registered in the state of Texas. His taillights did not work, and he does not have his license with him. He was able to mention to the cop that he left both his license, and this is the key, his military ID at home. You see, since he was military, he only got off with a $20 warning for not wearing a seatbelt. All other penalties were waived. Now, no matter what you think of this story and guilty or not guilty, I think there's something to be said for being on the side of the government. Not that that's our goal, but I believe that's why that ticket was only $20, whereas my wife would have had to pay close to $400. Another experience I had while living in Oz was the so-called shortage of water that came about every year, always attributed to the drought, and no doubt is happening this year again in Melbourne, and will be for the foreseeable future. Of course, government sees water as a problem. However, entrepreneurs see water as an opportunity, perhaps one of the greatest opportunities out there. Who doesn't need water? It is near impossible to imagine any private company not enjoying the problem of high demand for its products and services. Yet water is repeatedly reported as in shortage. There's one thing products with shortages have in common: government intervention, typically in the form of price controls. This was especially the case with water in Melbourne and has been for at least a decade. While supply of water is a complex issue, understanding economic shortages is not. Solving water issues is not a supply problem. Obviously, the planet is full of water. It's a technology and information problem, and it's an opportunity, and many are investing billions in its solution. Water is also not a homogeneous good. It can be used for drinking, sanitation, and many other uses. The government blames a shortage of water on drought and climate change, and while droughts may be created by a shortage of water, water shortages are created by an abundance of government rain. Despite almost yearly decreases in water storages in Melbourne, real prices have not increased significantly. This was from 2008 to 2013. The Essential Services Commission fixed prices for those 5 years in which prices were fixed and would not be raised. In 2013, the price will actually increase, I believe, by 34% or so. Although for the remaining 4 years after that, since they set prices in 5-year ranges, It's pegged to inflation for 4 years. The reason for the upcoming increase is to offset the public-private partnership of the desalination plant in Melbourne. This means regardless of supply or any other number of variables and uncertainty, real prices will remain roughly the same for at least 4 years. In other words, expect continued shortages. Instead of economical pricing, there's political pricing, where pressure groups and special interests are given rights to use water during droughts, and at subsidized pricing, businesses are able to use water for irrigation in the name of boosting GDP, while individuals are asked or forced to consume less and less. Again, government as friend of the little guy is simply a myth. Of course, one may argue that water is a scarce resource, and therefore naturally there may be shortages. Yet all resources are scarce. We live in a world of scarcity. Water is no different from wheat or copper in this aspect. Shortages do not exist in a free market because of the price system, including the profit and loss mechanism. Imagine a company such as Kohl's experiencing an increase in demand for its product, let's say Vegemite. Has two options. It could increase its supply and or its price. But if Kohl's was managed by government and experienced a decrease in the supply of Vegemite due to a lower supply of yeast extract for whatever reason, we can imagine solutions that might be offered. Maybe Vegemite will only be offered on certain days of the week, or to those with last names between A to M, or certain age groups or only individuals with red hair, or maybe customers can only purchase 1 jar at a time and must make it last for 6 months before the next purchase. Perhaps you might think this is outrageous and just simply not fair to government. Yet a look at the Australian government's attempts to combat a water shortage will show just how realistic these solutions are. Here are some of the current restrictions, and these are stage 1. They get worse as stage 2, stage 3, and I believe stage 4 which is Armageddon, I believe. Here are some of the restrictions. A handheld hose fitted with a trigger nozzle, a watering can, bucket, and manual dripper system can be used to water from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. or midnight to 2 a.m. Even-numbered houses can water on Saturday and Tuesday, odd-number houses on Sunday and Wednesday. No watering is allowed on Monday, Thursday, and Friday. A bucket filled from a tap can be used to clean windows, mirrors, and lights. New pools or spas of any capacity cannot be filled. Consult your water authority beforehand. Rebates were offered to consumers to consume less water. Imagine a private company like McDonald's telling its customers to buy fewer Big Macs, and then McDonald's offering to pay them for it. Or even spending money on an advertising campaign to consume fewer Big Macs as the government was doing. How about sending you a free packet as a promotion on how to consume less? Finally, you could receive a free 4-minute timer to make sure showers conserve water. And the government is wasting tax dollars on all these activities. What about penalties and enforcement? There were water patrols out in force across Melbourne. After a warning and continued disobedience to the government's water restrictions, your water supply may be restricted or you could face prosecution. Just to drive home the point, could McDonald's prosecute you for consuming more and more of its Big Macs? It is because of this economic nonsense that higher prices may be welcomed. Are higher prices a good thing? Well, yes, if by good, assuming a free market means supply and competition will increase and natural rationing will occur. It is important to remember that demand for a product occurs at a specific price. To understand why higher prices are a good thing requires moving beyond stage 1 thinking. It requires looking at the unseen. Higher prices are a good thing for producers and suppliers of a good. It encourages them to supply more of the good and to look at further investment in order to supply the good in the future. It allows the market to clear. Since prices act as signals akin to road signs that orient a driver, entrepreneurs will respond to higher prices and innovate in finding alternative sources of water, or by transporting water over longer distances. Labor and capital will be diverted into a search for more water, or more innovation in conserving and reusing existing water. But these are up to entrepreneurs who innovate with technological recipes. Once supply is increased to meet demand, competition or the threat of competition will most likely then lead to lower prices. Murray Rothbard wrote the following regarding this totalitarian behavior displayed by governments on these issues. Is there traffic congestion? Ban all cars. Water shortage? Drink less water. Postal deficit? Cut mail deliveries to 1 day. Crime in urban areas? Impose curfews. No private supplier could long stay in business if he thus reacted to the wishes of customers. But when government is a supplier, instead of being guided by what the customer wants, it directs him to do with less or do without. While the motto of private enterprise is the customer is always right, the slogan of government is the public be damned. Rothbard later points out, in an article titled The Water is Not Running, and in his book Making Economic Sense, he has at least 2 articles on water shortages. Most people agree that government is generally less efficient than private enterprise, but it is little realized that the difference goes far beyond efficiency. For one thing, there's a crucial difference in attitude toward the consumer, and this goes back to my experience with Connex authorities. Private business firms are constantly courting the consumer, always eager to increase the sales of their products. So insistent is that courtship that business advertising is often criticized by liberals and intellectuals as strident and unmannerly. Government, unlike private enterprise, is not in the business of seeking profits or trying to avoid losses. Far from eager to court the consumer, government officials invariably regard consumers as an annoying intrusion and as wasteful users of the government's scarce resources. Governments are invariably at war with their consumers. Parenthetically, in one of Rothbard's audio lectures on, I believe it's the one on advertising, he talks about how some consider advertising to be misleading and false and therefore bad. He says that, well, in that case, we'd have to outlaw John Kenneth Galbraith's books on economics since they don't talk about real economics. Just in case you can't see the bottom, government, if you think the problems we create are bad, just wait until you see our solutions. Similar to Mises' theory of intervention. Can government invest in anything? Australia's Prime Minister Kevin Rudd implemented a stimulus package as did most countries as soon as the global financial crisis hit. He was, using Henry Hazlitt's fallacy of the broken window, going around town breaking windows by, well, demanding they be built. There were over 35,000 construction and maintenance projects planned across Australia during the following 12 months. This included $49 billion dedicated to nation-building infrastructure. Shortly after Rudd's proposal, my daughter brought home a news bulletin from her primary school. It read, "We have now been advised that the Australian government will be funding a new building for our school. The old building will be demolished as part of this project. Because this is part of the government stimulus package, construction must be completed by October 2010. This is roughly the equivalent of digging holes and filling them. In fact, digging holes may be better, since in that case, mostly only labor is wasted and not other natural resources, such as those being used in construction. Where are the environmentalist outcries over this needless destruction of resources? Regardless, this is merely the broken window fallacy in new clothes. The real gem, however, came later in the bulletin. Council committees have met this week to consider a wide range of matters about our school. Major matters for discussion included possible uses of our new building. So they destroyed a building, built a new one, and did not know what they would use it for. Contrast this rationale with that of the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur takes calculated risks, typically builds using the carpenter's rule, measure twice, cut once. If it does not make financial sense to build, the entrepreneur will not do so. In addition, the entrepreneur would later know, through the profit and loss mechanism, whether such a decision was prudent or foolish. Many politicians speak of investing in infrastructure, technology, or jobs, but can government invest in anything? No. The word investment, in true government Orwellian fashion, is a euphemism for government spending. Investment signifies an accumulation of savings through lower present consumption, which will then be used to achieve potential profitable returns in the future. Isn't it bizarre how the more money politicians say they're investing, the more excited people get? Do people not realize that it is their money politicians are referring to? It is as if a thief approached you and instead of demanding half of your money said, "Since I really do care about you and your future, give me 90% of your money." Wouldn't it be better if politicians could say, "We're going to invest $10 and create thousands of new jobs"? Talk about a return on investment. Secondly, since an investment implies the goal of delaying current consumption to reap greater returns, i.e. a profit in the future, it must be pointed out that the reality is government has no non-arbitrary way to determine whether a government program makes a profit or a loss. Indeed, it typically does not talk in those terms. If a private company is making losses for whatever reason, it must change and innovate in order to make a profit. Or it will continually make losses and go out of business, assuming no government bailouts. But with the government, if a program is labeled as failing, it receives more money. In contrast, when private companies fail, it is not a proof of market failure. On the contrary, it is proof the market is working. It is eliminating failure. In sharp contrast, the government promotes failure. It is said if you want more of something, to subsidize it, i.e. take from someone and give it to someone else, robbing Peter to pay Paul. Government's solution to government failure is consistent with Mises' theory of intervention. Government meddling seems to require more government involvement and more money, and there is nothing as permanent as a temporary government program. Government investment through taxation means taxpayers must lower their current levels of consumption and or investment. As Murray Rothbard points out, when capital investment takes place in the free market, it deprives no one of consumption goods. For those who save voluntarily, choose investment over some present consumption. No one is required to sacrifice present consumption who does not wish to do so. As a result, the standard of living of everyone rises continually and smoothly as investment increases. But a Soviet or other system of compulsory investment lowers the standard of living of almost everyone, certainly in the near future. Standards of living will decrease as there will be a shift from private production and exchange to political demagoguery, as well as taxes levied on the more efficient to subsidize the less efficient but privileged group. As with most government programs, this creates a caste conflict where one man or group benefits at the expense of another man or group. Thus, we see government as a true originator of conflict in a society, whereas the market creates mutual harmony, the government engages in exploitation to achieve its ends. While Austrian economists, qua economists, do not necessarily promote economic growth, it is recognized true growth can only come through an increase in savings and investment by individuals in the free market, determined by how much they want to consume in the future compared to the present. On the other hand, government investment leads to either malinvestment or does not turn out to be an investment at all. An increase in government spending leads to an increase in government consumption, and a decrease in private saving and investment, the crowding out effect. Thus, we see that job programs distort the market by shifting workers and resources from the private sector to the public sector, toward government ends rather than consumers. Without a free price system and profit and loss criteria, says Rothbard, the government can only blunder along, blindly investing without being able to invest properly in the right fields, the right products, or the right places. A beautiful subway will be built, but no wheels will be available for the trains. A giant dam, but no copper for transmission lines. These sudden surpluses and shortages, so characteristic of government planning, are the result of massive malinvestment by the government. While governments will continue to meddle, destroy resources, and exploit their citizens in a parasitic way, I ultimately believe they will prove irrelevant. The exponential growth in technology and entrepreneurship and those who are affecting the lives of billions will lead the way forward. I highly recommend the book Abundance, Why the Future is Better Than You Think, or you can listen to the TED Talk by Peter Diamandis, who claims he is also a libertarian. He has founded Singularity University with Ray Kurzweil, and it's a wonderful talk and makes the case for optimism. I believe we should be optimistic about our future and work hard to make sure that is the case, both for ourselves and for our children. Ultimately, economic laws cannot be repealed, and our work in educating the public will prove fruitful. Let me finish where I started with Rothbard. By simply entering the public and intellectual debate from a principled and consistent libertarian and free market perspective, the Mises Institute, and we can add the Mises Seminar and all that is going on here in Australia, that's my part obviously, has already exposed the lies of that multitude of statists, would-be planners, neo-Keynesian economists, leftover Marxists, and pretenders who dare to use such glorious words as liberty, free markets, and free trade to connive at the exact opposite. Let us continue to press forward in this debate. Thank you.
Any questions?
I'm just wondering if you know of any government at any time in the world has operated correctly.
That's operated correctly, meaning not operated? I'm serious.
So you think there's none?
So I guess the example is what, Iceland? A long time ago or something? Something like that. Maybe the U.S. in its early days.
What about Singapore?
Singapore at the moment? I'm not familiar with Singapore, so probably shouldn't answer.
I guess in Western society, the euphemism government dovetails into democracy, which seems to be the antithesis of liberty then in these examples, because these people vote people in who then apply policy which is bad. How do you see democracy as a friend or foe of liberty?
Do I see democracy as a friend or foe of what?
Liberty.
So, H.L. Mencken said about democracy, right? It's the idea that people get to vote or whatever, and they deserve to get it good and hard, get what they vote for. So democracy in the sense of government democracy and voting, in the U.S. you vote for a politician and then they enact all these policies. You don't vote on individual policies, obviously. I think the best form of democracy is the dollar. We can vote with our dollars. We can vote where we want to spend our money. We don't have to do that coercively or through someone else. So if it's a political process of democracy, I think it's just like Murray Rothbard said, it's a gang of thugs writ large or something, right? It's two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner.
By majority vote.
By majority vote, exactly. I mean, Walter Block has a good example of that. If he walks in, he and his gang of thugs, not that Walter's a thug, but if he has two friends and they walk in and they're in someone's living room and they say, give us all your money, the person's going to say no. They say, okay, well, let's be fair, we'll vote on it. And of course, the gang of three votes to take away the money. They get the money, and democracy has come to pass. So obviously, there's nothing inherently ethical in that, unless it's democracy by voting with our dollars, is my view.
Hi. I was wondering what you think the connection between public-private partnerships and fascism is. Do you think there's a connection there?
Yeah, definitely a connection there. Absolutely. I think it's one of the most dangerous because it's one of the most subtle ways, and it's, we talk about the private industry and using it's sort of the best of both worlds, and I think it just slips past people, and they think that government, with all its wisdom and financial backing, can take the efficiency of the market, and therefore you have the best of both worlds. But I mean, that is a form of fascism, obviously, right? So I absolutely agree, and that's it. Socialism. The face of it in its full form is most people would probably shun outright socialism, but if you can repackage it as a public-private partnership, I think people are more willing to accept it. Therefore, it's more dangerous. Another quote from C.S. Lewis that's sort of like that is he says, Satan doesn't need you to commit adultery to get to hell if playing cards will do. And at the time, playing cards was the evil thing, meaning you don't have to go all the way. It just starts little by little.
That question about democracy protecting freedom, I put it to you that of all forms of government, democracy alone can corrupt a whole nation.
So I assume, Hans Hermann Hoppe has talked about this, right? That kings were better than democracy. He was here last year, I guess, because at least the king had the reputation to maintain ongoing, whereas democracy, you're just in power for a short time and then you're out. I'm just commenting on your comment, I guess.
Just on entrepreneurship and innovation, it's often perceived that patent law allows entrepreneurs to undertake innovation and then are able to recoup their fixed costs involved in research. In a society that doesn't have patent law, doesn't that provide more of an incentive for entrepreneurs to replicate ideas that are non-rivalrous rather than to participate in innovation, given the additional risk involved in the innovation, given that there's less likely to be able to recoup the fixed costs involved?
Meaning patents are good or bad?
Well, that's just the common argument for patents, is that it allows entrepreneurs to recover generally high fixed costs involved in innovation. I'm just wondering whether you might be able to enlighten us on the Austrian perspective on how innovation, there's still more of an incentive to innovate rather than for entrepreneurs to sit and replicate innovation, which might be perceived as a less risky endeavour.
Yeah, I mean, patents say innovation stops here, right? The argument for patents is, yeah, entrepreneurs wouldn't go to all the R&D, wouldn't invest in all of that if they weren't guaranteed some arbitrary amount of time to reap the rewards of that investment. But basically, patents say no more innovation; it stops here, right? And there's that book that came out that's free. What's it called? The Monopoly book. Someone knows what I'm talking about. Intellectual Monopoly, which is a free book, and they go into great detail on pharmaceutical companies, and they take on the big industries where the arguments for patents are most strongest, you would assume. But yes, in my view, get rid of patents, copyrights, all the intellectual property, and that would encourage innovation. Yes, it costs money to invest in R&D, but it costs a lot because of patents, because of rules and regulations, not necessarily because it would be a lot cheaper to invest, in my opinion, if you got rid of patents altogether. I would say that's the Austro-libertarian view, is to get rid of intellectual property. And
regulations are the main cause of the high fixed costs, and so if the regulations didn't exist, then the innovation in itself will be cheaper, and there'll be less reliance on the patent for to recoup the costs.
right,
That's the argument.
that's the argument, yeah.
Thank you very much. There's now a half-hour break for morning tea, and there's some food and drink at the back.